You went overseas the first time in '99, right, to
Congo.
Congo. But maybe just bring us up to speed. Like, what was it like for you in the reserve prior to that? What was like life as a reservist in Calgary? And then your motivation for going to Congo?
Understood. Well, context is everything. And a reservist context is dual-faced. There's the civilian side and the military side. So very briefly, on the civilian side in the 1990s, I was a self-employed chartered accountant. And life is tough being a self-employed professional. But at the same time, the level of training in the military was escalated up to Joint Reserve Command and Staff course, which was the first course beyond battle group training. It was MCSC at the time. And Joint Reserve Command and Staff course allowed insight into what multinational operations was like. Excellent lectures, excellent course material held at Toronto. So in the late 1990s, I had been given an opportunity into what the norms of multinational operations were. And at the same time, I was getting my ass kicked on Civvy Street with clients who wouldn't pay. So in 1999, when John Russell, who was then the Brigade G3, called up and said, "Hey, Joe, do you want to go to the Congo as a UN peacekeeper?" It was, howdy do you have a wooden ass? I was out of there in a New York minute, and fortunately, I've never looked back. So that may give you an idea of what life was like in the 1990s prior to the Congo. Recognizing that Bosnia had opened up in, I believe, the Balkans, should I say, in the mid-1990s. So one heard stories of what operations were like then, but they were just stories. The Congo is not the Balkans, different medium of peace operations altogether. But so by the 1990s, I had heard stories, as we all had, about what life was like at an operational tour in the Balkans. The end of the Cold War had come and gone. And so mid-1999, I was invited to go to PSTC in Kingston for military observer training. So that, I think, sums up the context prior to the Congo, which was the first tour. Now, your next question one of them might be, what is the motivation? And motivation, I think, addresses a very primal feeling in human beings. We do certain functions, and one of those primal functions is power projection. We all want to control our environment to some degree in order to maintain our sense of well-being. That is at the root of motivations. And of course, we add layers and layers and layers of motivations. So my motivation was to project my power in some very small fashion into an international theater of operations. I had no choice in the matter. Russell called up and said, it's the Congo or nothing. And so, of course, I said yes. But the motivation was really one of curiosity. This being a first tour, I really had nothing to go on in terms of expectations. I heard stories, you read the media, but the training in Kingston was purely functional, how to survive, first aid training, the rudimentaries of law of armed conflict and such. But there was really nothing in terms of theater specific. So the motivation was, I think, curiosity. And that is a motivation that is particular to a reservist. Had I been a Reg Force guy, the motivation would have been, if the boss says you're going to the Congo, you're going if you want another paycheck. So it would be interesting to run this kind of project alongside similar questions put to the Reg Force guys, just to get a balance of the different kinds of motivations. But your interest is one of motivations for reservists. My motivation for Congo was curiosity, and that really sums it up. And if I can just jump forward to the next tour before we go back, I think the next tour, which was Bosnia, it was a different motivation. Having had experience in the Congo with the United Nations, which is collective security, not collective defense, moving over to NATO operations in the Balkans, the motivation became Now that I know what international operations are generally, can I actually have an impact on the outcome of international operations in the Balkans? Different organization, different operational paradigm, but we're talking about motivations here. And so that motivation is distinguished from the first motivation, from curiosity. So we have curiosity and impact, first-time impact in operations. The third and final tour was Sudan, and that was back to a United Nations model of peace operations. And that was, again, the first time that I had a role of being able to deliver something in terms of planning, in terms of civil military coordination with the UN. So the motivation for Sudan was yet again different. So we have curiosity for the first, we have, can I make any impact for the second, and can I make a specific impact on the third? So I think that sort of sums up the different kinds of motivations, but it all comes back at the end of the day to the primal issue of power projection, because we do what makes us feel good. I think I might have answered that question perhaps a bit too long, but that's the firm base for motivations. Different organizations attract different motivations.
I'm just curious, you never, prior to this though, you never applied to go to the Balkans, for example, Croatia, Bosnia?
No, I did not. No. Why? I don't know. Because I was having too much fun being a chartered accountant. That's sick humor. No, but Russell's phone call occurred literally the same day that a client had told me he's going to stiff me for $23,000. So doors opening, doors closing, serendipity, call it what you want.
So the Congo, can you just tell me, what were your expectations first tour, and then the reality?
The expectations were that I would be a military observer. But again, we're moving from the norms, from the norms of PSTC, Peace Support Training Center in Kingston, to what was on the ground. And there was a huge differential. We go into these things expecting that the United Nations or UN peacekeeping operations follows a certain standard. But the standard in Kinshasa was dysfunctional, very dysfunctional, as it was in the Sudan, which is the other UN peacekeeping tour. So any expectations I might have had were naive. I was expecting the norm based on what I had learned in Kingston, but that is a fully functional peacekeeping operation following an operational planning process model with troops deployed, with there being collaboration between military and civilian agencies on the ground. And that was not to be. I was there on Roto 1, Roto 1 for Canada, but certainly not Roto 1 for any of the other troop contributors. So I guess the first thing that struck me is that the fragility of people and the fragility of people's character and their strength of character or their lack of strength of character. The one thing I noticed in the Congo was the grouping of nationals. The French military hung around with the French military, the Brits with the Brits, and so on and so forth. Canada had two people, had two individuals, my boss and me, and he and I did not hang around, which is just fine. But I'll get to that in a minute. But if we're talking about expectations, I guess there are two different sets of expectations. One is the personal expectation. What did I expect in terms of my own personal performance? And the answer is, I didn't know. Rather, I had no expectations because I had nothing to go on other than the norms of peacekeeping training. The other set of expectations was, how does a UN peacekeeping mission perform? But again, what gets taught in PSTC is quite different on the ground. But returning to the idea of fragility of character, there are national characters. The Brits are a nation of warriors, And that came out in how the British contingent at UN headquarters in Kinshasa operated. The French have a history in Africa, as do the Belgians. And I mentioned earlier I did not hang around with Canadians, being the only other one, but I did befriend the one and only Belgian, which turned out to be a lesson of life in itself. Because as you may know, the Belgians had the Congo as a colony for I don't know how long. And my Belgian friend who was serving as a Belgian officer had served in the Congo for the previous 15 years. And he knew the Congo backwards and forwards. And equally interestingly, he knew the people. And I guess if there's one, sort of looking over my shoulder, if there's one set of expectations that were fulfilled, but I did not have them at the time, was the importance of tribal politics in Africa. And this got played out in any number of anecdotes. But sitting in Kingston, we think of ourselves as nations. But in Africa, the business is not conducted like that. And that may also be the case in Afghanistan and other theaters. I don't know, I'm not there. But clan politics trumped everything in the Congo, as my Belgian friend allowed me to learn firsthand for myself. And so the expectations were that the United Nations would be doing collaborative work with other military troop contributors and with other agencies. But that proved to be not the case. I won't say it was a disappointment, because that presumes that there are unfounded expectations. But the level of dysfunctionality within the civilian side of the UN peacekeeping operation was noteworthy. The collaboration within the military was relatively better, probably because the military are used to working in a orderly, disciplined, hierarchical structure. Not so much so in the UN, where each agency has its own ground. So if I can illustrate some of the clan politics, my Belgian colleague introduced me to the chief of the Agence de Renseignement National, the information agency, which is a euphemism for the secret police. Nice guy, a farmer from Lubumbashi. But I met him, shall we say, in August. Nice guy. Went out and had lunch. And in September, I understood he was put in jail. And he spent the next 2 months in jail. And then in November time or so, he was released back to his former post. All this on the whim of President of the day, Laurent Kabila. And I asked, why is this so? Was he tried on a particular charge? And the answer was, and I'm collapsing a long conversation, was no, it had to do with tribal politics. Kabila had to be seen to be doing something, so he put this individual into jail for 2 months, so he was able to discharge that debt, and then he was released and back to his former post. So these are things that Canadians would not tolerate under a rule of law and liberal democracy and all the rest of that stuff. But that was one of the kinds of lessons to be learned. Lessons to be identified. Whether we learn them or not is a different issue. But the Belgians had a particular insight that I don't think anybody else had. And this speaks in part to Canada's standing in the international community, and Canada and Belgium perhaps rank similarly. But as I was leaving in the Congo in December, I was at the airport, marking time, waiting for my plane. I bumped into one of the Belgian civilian security guys working at the embassy. So we got to chatting about nothing in particular. And I said, well, Laurent Kabila, he's a bit of a despot, and he's a warlord and all the rest of that stuff. But I've sort of grown to like him, in a backhanded sort of way. And this guy said, yeah, well, he'll be gone within the month. And I figured that that was an offhanded comment. Oh yeah, okay, so people come, people go. But as it turned out, Kabila was assassinated on January the 16th. And I said to myself, well, the Belgians probably have that place wired very, very tight. And that's fine. So again, was this tribal politics? In a way, I think it was. There was stories that Muammar Gaddafi had wanted to be the leader of the Pan-African movement. And Mr. Kabila was probably in his way. And that the shooter of Mr. Kabila, President Kabila rather, was a Libyan who was also his personal bodyguard. Interestingly, the bodyguard got shot, so then there was no evidence of who actually orchestrated it. So the shooter of the shooter got arrested and charged with assassination. But again, I suspect this is all tribal politics. So those are the anecdotes, I think, that might color some of the lessons identified in the Congo.
Can you just take it right down to the personal level and just tell me just your circumstances in Kinshasa? Where did you live, and what was a typical workday for you?
I lived in an apartment by myself. I chose to do that. I chose to do that so I could practice my French, and if I may say so, I succeeded reasonably well. The typical workday started at 0800 with a briefing to the civilian and the military in the briefing room, and it was, as every other military briefing is, all the news. Actually, they went through G1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The workday then broke up back into our respective branches. So G1 did what they did. I was deputy G5 plans. I reported to a Brit who had extensive operational experience, Simon Strickland, and we had a junior from Bangladesh who was very well intentioned, but his interests were more in enjoying life in the Congo. Mine were too. But be that as it may, and I can get into the details of the work specifically in a sec. But the workday would end around noon, followed by a 2 to 3 hour nap because of the heat, and then would recommence at 6 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and end around 7, whereafter everybody would go home. The nature, because it was we were in Roto 1 for Canada, and the mission had really just been stood up perhaps 6 months earlier. There was a lot of work on plans, particularly bringing in battalions from the troop contributing countries. And the favorites are, as you may know, India, Pakistan, and Nepal. Those are the three, and Bangladesh. Those are the 4 big troop contributing countries. A lot of time was spent in planning how to deploy the battalions throughout the Congo, which is the size of Europe. So 4 battalions throughout Europe is not very much if you do the math. The Brit boss was blasé. He was not intense. He was blasé. He had done this a number of times, and he knew that he was going home in 6 months, and so he did a very good job, but he did not break his back on it. Nor did any of the other Brits. The Canadian, my Canadian boss did break his back. He worked very, very hard at his job, and he was DCOS Ops, Deputy Chief of Staff Ops. I worked very hard because this being my first mission, I thought that's what you do. But as it turns out, the pace of work in a United Nations mission is not, at least for the Congo, was not as robust as it might have been, and certainly not as robust as it was in Bosnia. And then, anyway, typical workday is doing plans for deploying battalions. We did an emergency evacuation plan in the case that the mission headquarters got run over. I did some work with the UN lawyers on refining the law of armed conflict. How do we apply it? Rules of engagement, and those are the tasks that first come to mind. But I spent a lot of time in the bars with my Belgian friend, and I learned as much about how life in President Kabila's Congo operates from listening to people in the bars as I did in the operations room at the headquarters. So again, coming back to your first question of 20 minutes ago, is what were my expectations? I could not have had these kinds of expectations because I just didn't know. But I'll tell you that the first day I got there, the UN people were confined to headquarters because there was civil strife, riots in the street and the rest of that. And my Congolese friend said, "Oh, that's bullshit, we're going to the bar." So we spent the remainder of the day in the bar, and to look at the other people in the bar, life is normal. So again, we Canadians and Brits and French and everybody else come to these theaters with different sets of expectations. Canadians are supposed to sit in the hotel like they're told and wait until they all clear. The Belgians, who have only been there for the last 100 years, yeah, what's the problem here? So expectations are relative to your national culture as much as it is to the personal. And again, to reemphasize the point, I was so naive, I just could not have constructed a formidable level of expectations.
How satisfying were those 6 months that you spent there?
On a scale of 1 to 10, about 50, and they remain that day today. And I would go back to the Congo in a heartbeat. As a matter of fact, I did go back to the Congo, and this is outside the context of the interview, but very briefly in 2008, when I was expert on mission with the UN, went back to do an evaluation of that mission, and life had not changed at all. Huge divisions between military and civilians. Nobody talked to each other. And the war in the Congo had been eclipsed by the war in Goma out in the eastern townships.
What was it that made it a 50 out of 10 for you?
The people I met and the fact that I had broken away from the Canadian paradigm of living. Life was not about driving up Crowchild Trail to go home. Life was not about putting up with clients who refused to pay or landlords who were onerous. Life was not about complying with the rules of chartered accountancy. Life was about learning, about listening to people who actually were victims of the war or who were warriors. Guys from Zimbabwe. What's Zimbabwe doing in the Congo? Well, they're there fighting on behalf of President Kabila for whatever reasons, I don't know, I couldn't fathom, but had something way past my pay grade. But life was exciting. You didn't know, with some extent, you didn't know what was going to happen the next day. But you could say that about every tour, couldn't you? But certainly in the Congo was very, very fluid, and I was on my own. My Canadian boss said, I'll see you tomorrow at 8 o'clock, goodbye. But in Bosnia, my boss said, I'll see you in 2 hours in the mess hall every day. But I did pretty well whatever I wanted to outside of the workday. So I did whatever you do in those in those places. Went to places that I probably shouldn't have gone, that I should not have gone to, talked to people that I should probably not have talked to, had my boss known. But that's the fluidity of a UN mission. Couldn't do that, and you wouldn't want to do that in the Bosnia, different tour, different rules.
So put that into some perspective for me. What's it like coming, your first tour, you finish it, you've had that independence. What's it like coming back to Canada, to Calgary, to the reserve that you left?
To Canada and to Calgary, in a word, depressing. Absolutely depressing. Excuse me. Why? Because I guess there's a sense of normalcy here in Calgary and in Canada. You know what's going to happen tomorrow. You know the traffic's going to be bad on Crowchild. You know that you're going to have dinner with your wife tonight and you're going to know what you're going to eat. There are no unfulfilled expectations in Canada. In the Congo, within reason, you didn't know what was happening. I had to bail my boss out of a jail in Lubumbashi. So I ended up walking down the streets at 2 a.m. with two shopping bags full of Congolese currency and not entirely sober. but that's what you did to get the job done. You didn't have to do that in Calgary. Why, you just sent a wire transfer from your laptop at home. So those kinds of the differentials are huge. And that walking down the street, I mean, that's just a small anecdote, but it got Tom Myatt out of jail, for which he still owes me.
You gonna tell me why he was in jail?
He was in jail because he's a loudmouth Brit. He had gone down to South Africa on leave and came back through Lubumbashi, and I guess being Tom Myatt, he was a Queen's Own Hussar, so armored guy, big mouth, big ego. He said some things that he shouldn't have to some border chap, like, do you know who I am? Or something. And the guy said, no, I don't know who you are, and quite frankly, I don't care, but you can spend the rest of the week there. So we got the operations, got a frantic call from Myatt saying, help, get me out of jail. Well, the Chief of Staff, Hamish McNinch, said, well, I'm not sure I really know how to handle this. And I said, I don't know either, but let me have a shot at it. And Hamish said, fine, go for it. So I managed to go to the local bar, where it is in effect a currency exchange, the Savannah, and waited there till closing, then took out whatever it was, $500 US, gave it to him, and he gave me 2 satchels full of Congolese currency, which I then took down to the bank the next day, which got wired to Lubumbashi, and then Myatt showed up with his stuff 2 days later, out of jail. So he was in jail for nothing in particular, just wrong place at the wrong time. But that's the way life is in the Congo, and Tom Myatt is not the worse for it.
So how did the experience change your perspective, perhaps, returning to the King's Own Calgary Regiment, the reserves?
The King's Own didn't care. At least I did not perceive they cared. I was invited to make a presentation at the Ranchmen's Club, courtesy of then Honorary Colonel Gordon Leonard, and I did so. But it was not lasting. It was, okay, so you've been to the Congo, that's nice. We got a Wainwright exercise, let's plan for it. So there was no lasting impact, and that which was fine with me, because I wasn't expecting anything. But the King's Own as a regiment does not celebrate, well, at that time, did not celebrate, celebrate isn't the right word, did not recognize the impact or the benefits that these tours had. I mean, Dick Cruikshank had gone on an earlier tour, good for him, comes back, life goes on. Same with me. It may be different in different units. It may be that the Cal Highs, they incorporate that experience into their regimental culture. King's Own don't. And that's not good or bad, that's just the way the KOs work. I'm sure every unit has its own protocols as to how it incorporates the experiences of overseas tours. So there's really not much of a story in terms of the King's Own, but then King's Own are not noted for particularly colorful or projecting its history, not like some other units.
But I do clearly get the sense that this whet your appetite for more.
You are correct, because it was an eye-opener. The tribal politics, the dysfunction, the tribal politics in Africa, the dysfunctionalities within the UN peacekeeping operations system, the fragility of human nature, the fact that some nations, Belgium in particular, can operate not with impunity, but they know the ground very, very, very well. And Canada doesn't. But yet Canada, you have to ask yourself, why did Canada offer to send troops to the Congo? What are the national interests that are being subscribed to? And we can speculate on that, but that's probably another story for another day.
But going forward now, your motivation to continue going overseas?
Yes, Bosnia. Well, at the time, after I came back from Congo, I got involved in training with CIMIC, Civil Military Cooperation. And Lieutenant Colonel Grant McLean up in Edmonton was running a very robust CIMIC training program. And Operation Palladium, which was the rotations sending troops to Bosnia, each rotation had an appointment for a senior liaison officer and G5 CIMIC. And so Grant McLean, being Grant, nominated me for that appointment with the 2nd Battalion Patricias from out of Winnipeg. And there was a lot of pushback from the 2nd Battalion, who wanted to send a Reg Force appointment, a Reg Force chap into that appointment. But Grant being Grant and Dennis Taberner being Dennis Taberner, they pulled strings, or they did that voodoo that they do so well. And I was fortunate enough to receive the appointment. Though Taberner took me aside one day prior to deploying and said, "You will not be welcomed." So, fine, thanks for the heads up. So I moved to Winnipeg in September of 2002 to begin training with Lieutenant Colonel Mike Day, at the time Lieutenant Colonel Mike Day, and the 2nd Battalion of the Patricias. And that training went swimmingly well. 2nd Battalion, and you may know from personal experience, 2nd Battalion is the rebel battalion, and they did a very good job of training everybody. There was a company of reservists, but they treated me exceptionally well. I was incorporated into every facet of training. I can't say anything at all bad about it. The training was outstanding. I was given unlimited amount of money. I had a group of, I guess, 12, perhaps 12 people working for me, all reservists. And whatever I wanted, I got. I could not ask for anything better. So that allowed me to think forward and say, all right, now that we're talking about power projection, coming back to the motivations, what can I do? And so CIMIC being CIMIC and its civilian military cooperation, we did a mission analysis and ended up collecting two container loads full of working computers. In fact, there was who are the potato people in New Brunswick? McCain's. McCain's gave us almost 2 container loads full of containers, which was currency with which to conduct CIMIC in Bosnia.
Sorry, you said 2 container loads of containers. Want to say that again?
Sorry, 2 container loads of computers, screens, CPUs, the whole 9 yards. Now, they had to be repaired, so upon arriving in Bosnia, a lot of people who fashioned themselves computer geeks, after they did their daytime job, would go to the computer tent and spend a couple hours rebuilding computers, making them so that they were functional, and that we could then use them as leverage for gaining cooperation in the peace rebuilding process in Bosnia. So moving from the Congo, where I really didn't know what to expect, to Bosnia, where I could now build my expectations. My expectations were that I, Joe Howard, would be able to have some impact on the peace rebuilding process, not just with computers, but through senior liaison and working with the Office of the High Representative. The Office of the High Representative, first of all, let's just back up. Remember that Bosnia is a NATO operation, NATO peacekeeping, not to be confused with the United Nations, different models of peacekeeping altogether. But the political arm of the NATO operation was an outfit called the Office of the High Representative. So I was able to exert my influence, if you will, by meeting with and collaborating with members of the civilian side in the Office of the High Representative, as well as with UN agencies who happen to be there, as well as agencies of the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe. But it was really a truly small I international organization headed up by the Office of the High Representative on the civilian side, and the military side being the brigade and our battle group being one of them. But the motivations were actualized in Bosnia, and I was able to actually have an impact and hence satisfy the motivation, projecting my own power.
Can I go back? Maybe it's a bit parochial by comparison, just to use the word of the day here. This is pre-Afghanistan. You've got the Reserve Infantry Company, the CRIC, correct? So they're part of this tour.
Yes.
There's a big reserve component.
There is.
How did that, I guess, how would you characterize relations, regular, reserve, the working relationship on that tour?
Very good. I believe that it was during the training in Winnipeg that I was able to build my street cred. And I think Ken Sabache, who ran the CRIC, I think he did the same thing. So that by the time we got to theater in February, there was a very healthy respect of regular versus reserve. Mike Gagne, who was running one of the other companies, he was a 2VP guy, he knew exactly what could and could not be expected from the reservists and what he could and could not expect from me. But because of the training in Winnipeg, the capabilities were virtually the same. To my untrained eye, I not being an infantry soldier. But to answer your question, there was very little, if any, differential in terms of capability, and expectations each of the other were flat. There was no differential.
And at the end of your 6 months in Bosnia, what were how satisfied were you with the contribution that ultimately you were able to make?
I was very happy because I knew what I had accomplished. And in fact, I think, had made something of a reputation in subsequent tours. In the handovers, I was advised that, the successors might not be as robust as we were. And this sounds self-aggrandizing, and it's not meant to be, but that's the words that were spoken. But I left Bosnia very satisfied that I now knew how to project power in an international theater, albeit I'm a minor footnote in history, and that's fine. I'm obviously, that's all I ever could be, and that's fine with me. But the fact is that I had passed the test. I could now satisfy that motivation. I projected my own individual power in my own diplomatic way.
Is there a day that stands out for you in that tour or the previous tour?
The day that stands out is probably one of the last days there when Mike Day, for whom I have a great deal of respect, and one of the two Army bosses in my life for whom I have any respect, took me inside and said, you and I got our strides together, it's just we got it a little bit too late. But by the end of, I guess, June, he and I were working hand in glove. He trusted me explicitly with everything. He asked me a question, I gave him the answer, and the answer he needed, not the answer he wanted. That day in the parking lot, just behind the weapons stores actually, when we just happened to cross paths and we spent 10 minutes. But that was probably one of the best day in Bosnia, just being told face to face, look, we are now working as a team. And Mike Day is all about projecting power, as you may or may not know. And to be told by him that we're working well, again, comes back to the power projection motivation.
How about again, the transition from this, again, back home, and then to your third tour? Anything different that way?
No, it was coming home to Calgary on an airplane is one of the most depressing things I can ever do. And that's just the way it is. Grass is always greener, label it whatever way you want. But by then, I had forsaken my chartered accountancy tour, and in the interim between Bosnia and Sudan, which was my third tour, I was picked up by the U.S. Department of Defense to do some consulting work in Eastern Europe. So that was, if you will, a continuation of the Bosnia tour, albeit in civilian clothes and albeit with a different boss. Same line of work though. It was civil-military relations, military diplomacy, call it what you want. But it was interesting to see the way that the U.S. handled themselves. When I was in Bosnia, one of the other remarkable days was a meeting that Mike Day took me to with the Deputy High Representative and Ambassador. He had ambassadorial status, Don Hayes. And he could do whatever he wanted in Bosnia. And he was the American side offsetting Patty Ashdown, who was the Brit side, Patty Ashdown being the High Representative, Don Hayes being the Deputy High Rep. sort of the good guy, the bad guy, if you will. And meeting with Don Hayes, just the things he said he was going to do blew my mind in terms of use of force, but not sending in battalions kind of force, but political force and economic force and diplomatic force. So that and the time spent in Eastern Europe were eye-openers on how a major U.S. power, the United States, actually conducts diplomacy. Fascinating. But if I can bridge to the third tour, during the third tour, we met with a delegation from Ottawa, including names who have escaped me, but it doesn't. Former Chief of Defense Staff Robert Fowler, whose name you remember, and Dallaire may have been there too. But it just struck me, all great guys and all great motivations, but Canada does not measure up to the United States. To state the blindingly obvious, and we can read about that, but to actually see that in the person is an eye-opener for me. But anyway, coming back, the motivation for Bosnia was similar to that the motivation for Sudan was similar to that of Bosnia. It was now, could I exercise my power, project my power? But instead of projecting it in a military structure of a battle group, it was back to this very fluid organization of a UN mission. Only this time it was Roto Zero, and we were literally the first military people in Sudan, in Khartoum. And the UN mission was being stood up. But not unlike the Congo, there was no cooperation. In fact, there was animosity, visible animosity, some directed at me. My counterpart was a very lovely woman called Julie Benarius, who was headed up the Civil Military Civilian Military Coordination side of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. She was my counterpart for civil military coordination. And she and I could not even agree on the time of day. And she tried to have me fired. But my boss, General Greg Mitchell, who was a diplomat par excellence, so, yeah, whatever. But whereas there was just dysfunctionality and a modest animosity between the civilians and the military in the Congo, it was relatively brutal in Sudan. But it depends what level you look at, because there were instances of great collaboration, and one instance in particular stands out. This was following the riots in Khartoum when the UN was wholly unprepared as to what to do. The special representative of the Secretary General ordered that the civilians and military will work together to come up with some sort of rapid reaction plan. And the day that he is signed off as having approved that was the day that we got a phone call from one of the regional representatives out in Western Sudan that there was a huge humanitarian crisis. And my boss at the time and I looked at each other. William English we said, oh, this is horseshit. This is some guy just doing a dry run to see whether or not our rapid reaction was working. But as it turned out, it was very real. And within 24 hours, we had a caseload of medicine for yellow fever on the way to some godforsaken place in Western Sudan. But the point being that the civilians, being the medical side and the small p political side, actually collaborated very well. And so that's the kind of event that I will remember as, in my own footnoted way, I was able to project my own influence and satisfy the motivation of actually having some impact on the outcomes in the Sudan.
So, and I'm cognizant that I have about 11 minutes. I know here 11 minutes. Yeah. So that you came back, but you haven't been overseas since. So,
well, that's not true, because in 2007 I went to University of London and in 2009 to University of Leiden. But in the interim, after I came back from Sudan, I ended up getting picked up as an expert on mission for the United Nations again. As I mentioned earlier, I went back to the Congo. In fact, I also went back to Sudan in 2000, late 2007, 2008, and early 2009. So I was able to get out of Canada one more time, albeit in the civilian context, but not military. But I will tell you one thing that really did annoy me is I put in for a UN tour in the Middle East. Don't forget, there are 3 of them, and I forget the names of them, but it doesn't matter. There were at the time 3 of them. Maybe you can recall the names. But I got a memo back from then the deputy commander of LFWA, Kelly Woyden, said you're unfit for an overseas tour. So that's fine. I get angry, get even, and get ahead. I got ahead, but I just said, that kind of horse shit is not on. But I'm not going to. You can't fight it. But if I'm unfit for an overseas tour, that pissed me off, big time.
Unfit how?
He didn't say. It was one of these one-liners. And next time I see Kelly Woyden in the Toronto airport, I'll kick his ass into next week. But that time hasn't come yet.
I do get the sense that this first tour was basically, it was very life-altering for you in terms of your direction in your life. Correct?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I cry a lot. But I hadn't cried before Congo. But if you ask me what happened in the Congo, I can't tell you. I don't know. No life-altering event. It's not like I got mugged I did get mugged in a back alley, but that's neither here nor there. Some guy tried to kill me in the Sudan, but that's neither here nor there. But there was something about the Congo, maybe the fluidity, maybe the lack of structure, and maybe that's it. I hadn't thought of it till now, but maybe it's the lack of structure in a high intensity environment. Maybe that was the key change between 1999 Calgary and 2000 Congo. And maybe that's what we have to be mindful of. It's not just, do you know how to give yourself an atropine shot if you get malaria or something. It's can you cope, or how do you cope with a change in structure? And these are the kinds of things that may creep up on you and you don't recognize it until after the fact. But you are correct. Of all 3 tours, Congo, on a scale of 1 to 10, it was 50 in terms of life-altering. Bosnia was great, but not life-altering, nor was Sudan, nor would the next theater, nor would the next operation be.
Do you think, though, that in some way, because you got out of that normalcy of the Calgary Canadian bubble, that you somehow maybe connected with your fellow humans on a more fundamental level? Is that what?
That's a good point, and I certainly saw a lot of unpleasant things in the Congo, both then and when I went back in 2008, but the context being the Congo. And the Congo was brutal. People on occasions lying in the street where they shouldn't be, dead. And those are things that you don't see in the normal, as you say, in the Calgary bubble. That's a good call.
And you say you cry a lot. What triggers it?
Don't know. If I knew, I'd tell you. But I can start crying just like that. I almost started crying in your camera 2 minutes ago. I cried I was doing a briefing in Bosnia in the kitchen. We had visitors in from something. I had a map and a stick and I was doing the usual briefing trick. And all of a sudden I started to cry. Well, I checked it, but I was that far away from saying, excuse me, I got to take a break. And I don't know. One of these things I may never know, but I can't tell you. If I knew, I would tell you, because I'd like to tell you, your viewing audience.
Do you have any other, I don't even want to call it symptoms, but other sort of maybe residual effects from your...
I have no expectation. Coming back to expectations, I go through life with as few expectations as possible. It's because I don't want to be surprised. And this comes back to sort of almost a philosophy that John Russell, the G3 who called me up to ask me if I wanted to go to the Congo. So one of his words of advice was, don't have expectations. You must always be flexible. Of course, he had his own time in Bosnia, but That was in the mid-90s. A different Bosnia from mine. But no, it's this impulse to cry for no reason. But if I ever find out, I'll let you know.
We have about 5 minutes of recording time. Is there something that you want to say or talk about that I haven't touched on with you yet?
Yeah, I would. And I guess it's a comment that applies more to reservists. Actually, I guess it applies exclusively to reservists. And that is reservists, as we discussed at the beginning, run a dual-faceted life, a civilian and a military. And a operational tour, such as the ones that I've been fortunate enough to get, give you an opportunity to mature in a way that you will never get anywhere else. And this is not to be confused with warfighting tours. I did not go to Afghanistan, and I don't know what Afghanistan is like. Excuse me. But I pride myself on my strengths in military diplomacy, which was the common denominator throughout all three of my tours. So I'm a fighter. I'm not a fighter. I'm a lover, or I'm a diplomat. But military diplomacy is an comparatively easy thing to exercise. I think it's less stressful than warfighting, not having been a warfighter. But I would encourage, I do encourage everybody who is a reservist to try to get outside the Calgary bubble. So at least you have a basis for comparison.
Can you imagine looking back in your reserve career, can you imagine, I don't know, staying in as long as you did if you didn't have those experiences?
No, I cannot. I gave up opportunities to be CO, I don't know how many times, in order that I could go on tours. I would not change that for the world. You know, stick a needle in my eye, but don't take away my tours. You learn so much more than you do sitting at a desk answering your brigade as to why you're over budget. Boring. But someone's got to do it.
That's great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.